Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Walking Those Musical Streets with Ensemble Hesperi.
I'm MJ, recorder player.
And I'm Tom, continuo player.
Today we're going to be exploring the 18th century world of West End London, so the London Theatreland, Drury Lane, where we're just about to walk in a minute, and Covent Garden Market. Very exciting places.
Yes, today it's characterised by the famous market, especially at this time of year with Christmas just around the corner. There's lots of exclusive shops and, of course, many theatres. And it wasn't so different back in the 18th century.
Yes, maybe a little bit less exclusive, but certainly full of music, full of theatre. Very exciting. Here we are in front of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. There's been a theatre here on this site since 1663 in various incarnations. Over the years, particularly in the 18th century, it tended to burn down. But of course now it's owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber and is undergoing some refurbishment. It's about to show Frozen, of course. Here in the 18th century, European musicians from absolutely everywhere used to come to London and get work in the orchestra here at the theatre, including Finger, Pesibile, Handel, Sammartini, Pepusch. Most musicians in 18th century London would have been associated in some way with this theatre. Also, our favourite Scottish Baroque composer, James Oswald, actually performed in the interval here on several occasions as sort of kind of entertainment. And once in 1743 he played a Scots tune, perhaps even of his own invention.
I'm now round at the other side of the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane. One of the most famous musicians to have been associated with this particular theatre is Henry Purcell, and it was at this theatre where many of his most famous operas and pieces of music were given their premiere. What would audiences have been like at that time? According to all of the reports that we can read, audiences at this time were pretty raucous and also rather fickle. And they were very accustomed to making their feelings very well felt. They would have requested many encores, much more than today, and would have been quite raucous about when the starts of performances actually would have begun. One of the most famous periods in this theatre was when David Garrick was the manager. He managed it for 29 years, and it was under him that it rose to being one of Europe's most famous theatres. A new theatre was built on this site in 1794, and there it was really at the forefront of stagecraft. We have reports of there being ships on stage, and water on stage, and lots of exciting machine effects.
Here we are in Crown Court, which is just off Russell Street in Covent Garden. And hidden away here is a Scottish Presbyterian church, Crown Court Church of Scotland, which has actually been here on this site, though not exactly the same building, since 1718. And it's an absolutely wonderful building inside. Do visit if you get a chance, for a Sunday service, of course. But actually, one of our musicians, Robert Bremner, was a member of the congregation here. He came from Scotland in about 1762 and joined the congregation. And he actually lived on the Strand, where he had a music shop, so it wouldn't have been very difficult for him to come to church here. Bremner was a very interesting man. He actually was very interested in improving psalm singing in 18th century London, and particularly in the Scottish churches. Both this one and also a congregation at Swallow Street. Bremner was determined to improve psalm singing. He wanted to improve it so that harmonious praise would prevail everywhere. And this is a lovely quote from his Rudiments of Music. He says that it would enable members of different congregations, when met together, to join with skill and alacrity in that part of worship, and that the harmony of united parts, when performed regularly by a numerous congregation, strikes the soul with awe and reverence, and greatly heightens devotion. The grandeur of the music alone might induce some to go to church, who are otherwise indifferent about it. So Bremner really wanted to make music both high in quality and add to worship as well. A reminder that, of course, not all music in 18th century London was secular. Sacred music was a very big part of people's lives as well.
As is to be expected from such an artistic area, there were many music shops around here, in the area around Covent Garden and Russell Street and Drury Lane. When we're researching, we don't have street numbers to go off when we're trying to find places, and so we have to go off the names of things like coffee shops, other shops, and also signs.
We do know that there was a music shop in Russell Street, and it was at the sign of the Orpheus. We can't really tell where it was because it was opposite Tim's Coffee House, which sadly hasn't lasted to 2020. But we do know that it was run by an L. Pippard, and that he published country dances here. So that's a fascinating thing.
Very interesting, right around where we're standing now.
Here, there was a coffee house in the 18th century where Boswell and Johnson had an amusing conversation about the Scots. There were, of course, lots of coffee houses in this area, and in fact, they were doing lots of music in these coffee houses, I think. Informal, of course, fun music, amateur music making, and probably quite a bit of singing as well.
Well, here we are in the bustling heart of Covent Garden Market. There has been a market here since the mid-17th century. It's a very old market, but the covered market that we see today actually came in 1830. And of course its character has changed a little bit over the years. Originally this was not the very snazzy shopping district that we're in now. It was a very colourful area, as you can imagine, from the theatre land. It was full of lots of taverns and lots of very unusual bits of activity, I'm sure. In the 18th century, this whole area was owned by the Duke of Bedford, whose name is reflected in many of the street names that we have today, in fact. And he had a very large, stately home, whose grounds stretched all the way down to the Strand. He later allowed large amounts of housing to be built on that land during the 18th century.
Now we're in the little churchyard next to St. Paul's Covent Garden. It's super busy out there. But here, you might remember from the film My Fair Lady, when the main character is selling her flowers just next to the church. Of course, we can imagine in terms of musical language, of course, all of the fruit sellers, vegetable sellers, everyone selling their wares in the 18th century would have had their own musical cry. Something that is just absolutely wonderful to hear, and you can still hear in London markets today. Well, you'll almost certainly recognise this, the Royal Opera House, one of the most important buildings in Covent Garden. This is actually the third theatre that has been on the site. The first one was built for an opening in 1732 with the Beggar's Opera, a very famous opera of that time. And actually, the first serious works to be heard there were Handel's oratorios and various others of his musical works, which were premiered there between 1735 and his death. He actually gave his organ to this theatre, but unfortunately it was burnt in a fire in 1808. Well, we've come to the end of another episode of Walking Those Musical Streets. Thank you so much for joining us.
Next time, we're going to be heading a little bit further east, down towards the city, and exploring the publishing world of Cheapside and St Paul's Churchyard. See you again.
Bye-bye.